Well, I hope you're enjoying all this year has to offer, and you're enjoying some of the great sounds and stuff of the season. Maybe you've gotten to see some concerts or programs or watched your Hallmark movies or whatever you do this time of year. And I know our family's doing that. We have a tradition every year that we have a family gingerbread house contest, which happened last night, and it's become a pretty big deal. If you would like to vote for the winner, you can do that on my Facebook page. And it's pretty serious stuff. I'm serious. I mean, there's a $50 gift card at stake. And so it's like Katie bar the door. They are against all their siblings and only for themselves. It's crazy to see, but that's what we do every year, and we have a great time doing it. It gets our family together. That's why we do it. Just gets our family together and have a lot of good fun, and we do stuff with the grandkids while the kids and their spouses work on the gingerbread houses. So I think you'd be surprised at what you see. Most of you who've watched us over the years, you know that they get really serious about it, really do. So be a part of that. We'd love to have you join me. Till midnight tonight, that's all you got. So get on there and vote, all right? They would appreciate it. The thing about familiar things, most of us, we like the familiarity of Christmas, and I'm no different. You may remember a few years ago, if you've been here long enough, I did a Christmas series called Cribs. Does anybody remember that? It's been a while. Yeah, some of you remember that. It was based on that show, Cribs, where a crib meant your house, your home. I don't even know if it means that anymore, all right? But you might remember what I did at Christmas time was I went into my crib, my house, and we did a video of my Christmas decorations because our home is very decorated. As I shared with you last week, we got stuff all over the place. And so I showed you some things, and I thought I'd take you down memory lane a little bit, those of you who might remember this. You remember I showed you the stockings that we hung. Those are all homemade stockings with everybody's name on them. Now, if you count them, there's 9 there. Right now, we have 19. It's unbelievable what's happened in 5 years. Anyway, I showed you those, and then I showed you my nativities, and I talked a little bit about that last week, right? And I have so many nativities that I had to put them up the stairway. We put one on every step and beyond. I mean, we just had them all over the place. And then there was my village, which was, to me, my crowning achievement as far as Christmas decorating was concerned. And I've been doing this for years. Well, in 2015, after my parents had passed away, we sold our house, big house, had room for all this stuff. We downsized because all the kids had gone, we thought. And so we rented a very, very small 3-bedroom home. Now, all of our Christmas stuff would not fit, and that first Christmas was very hard for me. I mean, because basically all we had was a tree. I had no place for villages, very few place for our nativities, and we had the outside, and that was it. And it wasn't the same. Well, maybe you've been there. It just wasn't the same. And so as we have gotten through the next 3 years, I have done my best to make Christmas familiar again. I have found places to put things that nobody would ever dream of. I took over the kitchen, okay? And in the kitchen, the cabinets, the top of the cabinets and the ceiling have about that much room in them. So I said, hon, get all your stuff off of here at Christmas time, and I'm going to put my stuff up here. And if you go to our kitchen, it's got nativities all over the place, up on top. And then we put them everywhere else we can find a place. And I told you last week we got like 50 or something of those nativities. Part of them are in my office because we still didn't have room. And then I found a way to get the village. And this is the first year I've been able to get the village. And basically what I did was I took over more of the kitchen. And this is what it looks like now. I finally got it up. I took up the whole bar area, and I got my village up. I took a picture of it, sent it to my kids. I said, after 5 years, the village is back and will always be back. And finally, for me, it's Christmas again. The familiar that I've done for years was back. Thank goodness. But that's what we like about Christmas, isn't it? The familiarity. I mean, we're familiar with the decorations that we do each year. We're familiar with the music of Christmas. And when we throw a Christmas song in that's a little unfamiliar, you know, you kind of struggle with it a little bit. Or it's a song that's supposed to be familiar and we changed it up a little bit and you go, whoa, what happened? I was going to sing Noel, Noel right there and it just didn't happen. Because we're comfortable with the familiarity. But sometimes when God invites us into his story, we find ourselves in unfamiliar territory. And sometimes because we like familiarity so much, we don't really understand that we're doing it. We just do it. I mean, it's not just Christmas. I mean, it's in everything. For instance, I pretty much know when you're not here because you sit in a familiar seat every single week. And I look at that seat and I go, oh, where's Carol and Connie today? I know, they sit right up here. Where are you? That's just familiarity, right? Sometimes we park in the same place if it's available. I mean, we go to the same stores. They're familiar to us. And when Walmart builds a new store and we walk in and it's suddenly not like the old one, what do? What? I don't know where anything is. And it's unfamiliar and it's uncomfortable, isn't it, until you get to know it better. I mean, that's just how we are. And thank goodness H-E-B will never do that to you. Man, it's every same store every single time because I think they know that we're comfortable with what's familiar. But the struggle for us is that sometimes when we follow God, it leads us into some very unfamiliar territory like it did with Mary and Joseph. And so what I really want you to remember today is what I told you earlier. You can find God in the unfamiliar if you realize that he's still at work in your circumstances. And you may be at a place this time of year where you are in an unfamiliar place in your life. I know the past week and a half or so, I've had 3 people that I've been connected to in a deep way who've passed away. 3. And those families are in unfamiliar territory right now. They've never been through a Christmas without that loved one. They've never had a future without that loved one. And so sometimes that's where we find ourselves. And it doesn't have to be geographical. It can be emotional. It can be socially. It can be financially. We can find ourselves in all kinds of unfamiliar circumstances. But I want you to know before you leave today, God is still at work in your circumstances, even though they're unfamiliar. So let's go back and look at those verses that I read earlier, and let's just get some promises from that we can take with us, because if you're not in an unfamiliar place right now, I guarantee that you're going to be eventually, especially when God invites us into his story and we obey and follow him. So in Luke chapter 2, let's go back and read these verses again. And the thing about this story is, you're so familiar with this passage. While I was reading it a while ago, you probably were going through the words in your head because you know it so well. It was familiar to you. But you got to understand, this wasn't familiar to Mary and Joseph at all. And it was very foreign. And they found themselves in very unfamiliar circumstances. So let's go back to verse 1 again. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. I asked the first service this. One person got it. Anyone know why they did a census? You got it. Why does anybody do a census? They want to know who can pay taxes, and that's exactly what happened. They were taking a census, the Roman government was, so that they could find out who wasn't paying taxes and make them pay their taxes. You know how tax collectors were in those days. So they were taking this census, which meant that everyone had to go and register. And in verse 3 says, everyone went to their own town to register. And your own town meant the place you were born, okay? Place you were born. Think about where you were born, okay? I was born in a little town called Cleburne, Texas. And if they were taking a census now and I had to do that, I would have to go all the way back there to register so that they would know that I'm alive and I can pay taxes, okay? So everyone went to their own town to register, and Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. So Mary and Joseph, they leave their hometown, the familiar, Nazareth, and they take what would be a 4-day trip to Bethlehem. Now, Joseph was born here, but probably didn't go there very often because it was a hard journey to take. And we don't know, but it may be that he hadn't been there since his birth. But at any rate, it was an unfamiliar place for both of them. And if there's anything the Christmas story tells us, it tells us this: God works in unfamiliar places. And this place was very unfamiliar to them. And often that's where we go, isn't it? I mean, we choose to obey God, and we find ourselves in a very confusing and unfamiliar place. And we follow him because we're certain that he was calling us, and we do what we believe God wants us to do, but sometimes we find ourselves in this, well, God, what are you doing here? I mean, if you're really obeying God, shouldn't everything be going right? I mean, there should be obvious signs and wonders. There should be success. There should be great clarity, but not always. And sometimes we think, God, this is so confusing. Are you sure this is where you want me to be? So unfamiliar. And sometimes we just say, is this really from God? I just can't picture God choosing to do things like this in places like this. And even though there may be what appears to be a lack of success, there may be pain, there may be confusion, and doubt begins to move in. Our expectations haven't been met. We find ourselves in an unfamiliar place, and we just think this can't be from God. Maybe God's abandoned me. But I want to assure you this morning that God is still at work, even in your unfamiliar place. He works. Verse 5. Joseph went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Now, it says in that verse 6, while they were there. So while they were in Bethlehem, they weren't in their hometown, which means they didn't know very many people in Bethlehem. It was a place of just strangers for the most part. And when you think about it, and maybe you haven't thought about this, they didn't even have a bed, not a normal bed anyway. And we're very familiar with the idea of Jesus being born in a stable or in a barn, or probably more than likely it was a cave. We're familiar with that, but probably that's not how it happened. He wasn't just out there alone on a midnight clear and it was all quiet and the crickets were chirping and Jesus was born. More than likely, because of the census, there were people everywhere trying to sleep wherever they could find a place. So more than likely, there were people all over the place. Strange people, which tells us this, that God works among unfamiliar people. God works among unfamiliar people. God may call us to be a part of his story, and it may involve people that we don't even know. I remember when I was the summer of my senior year of high school, my parents, my dad took a new church about 35 miles away from where we lived, and so they had to move. And for those of you who have kids in school, you know how tough it is to just pick up and move, but especially senior year. And so they were gracious enough to allow me to finish school in my high school, but I had to move in with a family that lived in the district so that I could play football. And then once that was over, I could move back with them. But when they moved, they had a little social and get-together for the pastor and his family. And I remember as a teenager going into a very unfamiliar house among unfamiliar people that I had no clue who they were. And it's very uncomfortable for a teenager and for adult for that matter, but there I was, very unfamiliar. But at that unfamiliar house, among those unfamiliar people, I met the woman who had my children. So you never know how God's going to work in an unfamiliar territory. God is still at work, and he works among unfamiliar people. And maybe your situation now, or maybe your situation in the future, is going to get you around people that you don't know and you're unfamiliar with and maybe uncomfortable because of that. But you have to realize God may use those people. I mean, think about the unfamiliar people who surrounded Mary and Joseph that first Christmas, the shepherds. I mean, they came out of nowhere. They didn't know who they were. And a short time later, Magi from the other side of the world. Who the heck are they? Strangers, unfamiliar people. Yet, God still works in unfamiliar circumstances, among unfamiliar people. Hold on to that. It may just be a part of his plan. And then our last verse, verse 7. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm guessing that the birth of Jesus didn't happen the way Mary was expecting it to happen. Now, those of you who are moms, especially the first time, I mean, you had expectations, right, of what was going to happen. And you dads too, but you really didn't have a clue. But anyway, you moms out there, you prepared yourself by getting familiar with it, didn't you? Especially if it was your first one. I mean, you got familiar with your doctor. You got familiar with the hospital, possibly. You got familiar with the procedure, what all was going to happen, when it was going to happen, who was going to be doing it. And I don't know if they still do this, but when I was about to be a dad, there were birthing classes. And you got familiar with how to coach your wife through the process, even though it didn't work and didn't matter at the time. But you learned. But you became familiar with all of it, right? And so you kind of had this expectation, and I'm sure Mary, even though she didn't have the same things we have, had the expectation of, hey, you know what? I'm going to have this baby. I'm going to have my midwife, my family around. All this is going to happen. And then all of a sudden, boom, changes everything. They have to go out of town for a census. She's 9 months pregnant, finds herself in an unfamiliar town among unfamiliar people, and then surrounded by animals, flies, stench. I'm sure that she didn't expect that. But that was exactly what God had in mind. Now, she may have been questioning it at the time. I would have been. God, are you sure? I mean, are you sure this is where you want the Son of God, the Messiah, to be born among all of this stench and the hay and unfamiliar territory? God, are you sure? And God knew exactly what he was doing. It was unfamiliar to Mary and Joseph, but it was very much a part of his plan, and that's what you need to remember, that God works in unfamiliar environments. God works in unfamiliar environments. And God chose to use the weak, the humble, the simple, the lowly, in order to bring his plan of redemption about. You know why? So that no human being could lay claim to the plan. Because no man in his right mind would choose an illegitimate son of a carpenter, be born in a barn or a stable, in order to save the entire human race. God in his wisdom, knowing us so well, knowing us better than we know ourselves, chose to do things in a way that was unfamiliar and didn't make sense to the rest of the world. So you can bank on it. In the midst of unfamiliar circumstances, unfamiliar places, unfamiliar people, unfamiliar environments, God is still at work. You can find him there. And one of the reasons I believe that God uses the unfamiliar is because that's how he gets our attention. We get so used to things because we're so familiar with them, right? I'll give you an example. Also at Christmas in my house, my wife in the kitchen, the only part I let her have, is the coffee bar. Now you know why I let her have it. I love coffee, so she puts up a coffee bar. We have it all year round, but at Christmas it's extra special because she makes homemade biscotti. She's got all these peppermint flavorings of hot chocolate, and she's got all these pumps of syrup, and so, I mean, it's very inviting when you come over. You know, if you want a cup of coffee, what kind would you like? I got it all, you know. It's a really cool thing. Well, this past week, I must have gone 3 days getting coffee like I normally do, morning, sometimes in the evening. And I didn't notice something that she put on the coffee bar until about 3 days later. And one day I looked to the right and I went, what is that? Let me show you. She put a little sign over on the right-hand side. Can you see that? Yeah, it says, I like my coffee hot, say it with me, just like my husband. Yeah. And I tell you what, I mean, I didn't notice it for 3 days. You know, she's been wanting me to see it. You know that. And so I finally saw it, which made me wonder, okay, is there anything else I missed? And then over by the tea kettle, I saw another sign that said, hot tea, just like me. But isn't it something how familiar we get with things that we don't notice other things? And it grabs your attention. And I think that's how God grabs our attention. The unfamiliar. Christmas song that sounds a little bit different means something new and different, even though we may have heard it before. One thing I want you to know is that God invites all of us into his story. He invites us to follow him. And his story is always a story of redemption. It's a story of redeeming you and me, and it's a story of redeeming the world. And he has invited us into that story. But when we get that invitation and we accept it, it will sometimes place us in very unfamiliar territory. And when it does, as uncomfortable as it is, and as painful as it may be, please understand, God is still working. And if you need confirmation, you can do what I did. Last week I told you I go to David sometimes because I can relate to him in a situation. And there's a scripture that he wrote in Psalm 37, and I'm sure that Mary and Joseph, they had access to this too. And then maybe they read it, maybe they claimed it, I don't know. But it's something that I hold on to. It's Psalm 37. I want to put it on the screen. And it says this, the Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights, listen to this, in every detail of their lives. Though they stumble, they will never fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand. And what I want you to know this morning, if you're in an unfamiliar situation right now, God is holding your hand, because that's what he does. And you can take that verse, and I do this many times, and I personalize it, and I put my name in for the pronouns. And I say, though Bobby stumbles, he'll never fail because God holds him by the hand. And maybe that's what you need to do. Put your name in there. And know that among anything that you're going through that's unfamiliar, that God is at work. And according to Romans, it says that every good thing comes from God, and that he's working it for your good because he's conforming you to the image of his Son. It's all about the plan of redemption. And maybe he's inviting you into it today.